Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. My name is Mehreen.
And I'm Simon Kuper. This is the football show where we take the hero and we show you the human.
From Johan Cruyff to Megan Rapinoe.
And from George Best to Kylian Mbappe.
This is the Human Football Podcast. Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans for our first emergency episode of this podcast series, because I've managed to get into my car and Simon sounds like he's sitting in his bathroom to talk about the shock appointment of Arne Slot as the next manager of Liverpool. So usually on Heroes and Humans, we give someone, our protagonist, some full biographical and documentary treatment. But in this episode, we're just going to give you a quick and dirty biography of the man who's going to be the next Liverpool manager. Simon, how are you feeling?
As a lifelong fan of Dutch football, I'm massively chuffed. You know, not often the Dutch managers get in.
I feel like this is a moment that was potentially made for this podcast because he's Dutch. Nobody knows who he is. Apart from you, you probably are the only person who's working in British football that knows really anything about this guy and what makes him tick.
I am such a Dutch football geek that I remember Arne Slot, the player.
Yeah, that's nothing to be proud of. So, before we get started, because the man is Dutch, Simon, we can get into our semi-regular series of asking, how do you pronounce the white Northern European man's name?
Arne Slot. I'm sure everyone is going to get there in the end.
I think everyone's going to ignore it, but it's not Slot, it's Slot.
It's not Slot, it's Slot. Slot. Arne Slot.
Oh, Slot. Okay, so...
Yeah, that's better already, yeah. And
okay,
it's not
I'm actually good at this.
Yeah, you'll be speaking Dutch in no time. It's not Arnie like the bodybuilder either.
Yeah, it's definitely not Arnie. I mean, even Arnie is offending me. I mean, I can't turn on my TV now without hearing this guy being called Arnie. Anyway, let's give you a few stats about Arne Slot. He's probably going to be one of the most expensive managers in Premier League history. That's because Liverpool could be paying up to about £10 million to secure his transfer from Feyenoord this summer. Slot almost ended up in the Premier League last summer when Tottenham were very close to getting his signature before Feyenoord, his club, decided that they weren't ready to part ways with him, and Tottenham ended up with Ange Postecoglou, which in hindsight wasn't too bad for them. And just a couple of months before that, Leeds United really wanted Slot to help them stay in the Premier League when they sacked Jesse Marsch in the middle of the 2023 season. But now, the Dutchman is finally making the jump to the Premier League and probably to the second most successful club in recent times, Liverpool, where his job is going to be his hero, Pep Guardiola at Manchester City. Slot has been in very high demand from English clubs because he managed to win the league with Feyenoord last season, only the second time they managed to do that in nearly 20 years. And to my great pleasure, Slot's Feyenoord have also been slapping up Simon's lowly Ajax this season and latterly with a 6-0 win at home just a couple of weeks ago. So Simon, give us your hot take on this pretty surprise announcement.
The first thing to think of is it's a massive jump for this guy. He spent almost his whole career before 2021 at very small clubs as a player and coach in the Dutch provinces. He's had almost no experience of big football, never been in a Champions League knockout game, never been near international football except if you bought a ticket to a Holland match. He is not an alpha male like Jurgen Klopp. He's not going to be the new Klopp, but he's very similar to Klopp in one sense in the kind of football he wants to play. And, you know, he likes a very Kloppian, Guardiolan pressing game, and Klopp and Pep are his role models. And so there's two parallels I draw. One is with Erik Ten Hag, which might make Liverpool fans wince. Hasn't been a hugely successful Man U manager, but, you know, quite a similar figure, a slightly uncharismatic, bald guy from the Dutch East, not the heartland of Dutch football at all, and neither had spectacular playing careers, and they both favour this very similar style of pressing football, which Ten Hag has failed to implement at United. And the other parallel is with Bob Paisley. Just a quick story about why. 50 years ago this week, Bill Shankly manages his last game at Liverpool. It's the FA Cup final 1974, Liverpool-Newcastle, Liverpool win, and afterwards Shankly says to Liverpool, look, I'm exhausted, I'm quitting. And Liverpool then, like Liverpool now, go for an unknown, uncharismatic figure. Back then it was Bob Paisley, Shankly's assistant. The kind of reaction in England at the time was Bob Who. And why did they go for Paisley then and for Slot now? They're going for a continuity manager, somebody who is very like the guy, the uber charismatic leader figure they had in place, who's not going to change much, who's going to refine things, and who's going to stay with the tradition. So Slot's job at Liverpool, which he's very happy to do, is to be a Jurgen Klopp mini-me.
So that's pretty auspicious, potentially auspicious parallel from the past. And so, Simon, you mentioned that he's a Kloppite. Tell us a bit more about growing up in the provincial parts of the Netherlands, a region that I've also heard been called the Bible Belt of Holland.
He's from pretty near the Bible Belt. He's from a place called Bergentheim, which has a faintly German name with Heim at the end. It's 10 minutes drive from the German border. So he's practically a German manager. Liverpool almost have hired a new German manager. His village is about 30 miles from Ten Hag's hometown. Both his parents were teachers. His sister still is a school teacher. His wife was a teacher. So that's very much the world he comes from, his métier. And that's kind of how he sees himself as a coach. He says, look, all coaching staffs now know tactics. They have experts on tactics. So what distinguishes the really good managers, he says, is how to deal with your players and explain things to them.
Another auspicious parallel with Klopp is that Slot also has a long playing career, but a pretty undistinguished one. I know that, Simon, you do remember him, but was there anything remarkable about Slot as a footballer?
Well, the guy had an 18-year playing career, pretty much all at small clubs in the Dutch second division, the Eerste Divisie, and then in the Eredivisie, which, is the league that Brian Clough called the Mickey Mouse League. He spent the beginning and the end in Zwolle, the club of his region, and the guy couldn't run. He was a very slow number 10. He was a lovely footballer. He had skill. He could see the pass, the through ball. Somebody once called him the Xavi of Bergentheim, which is a accolade he still cites with pride.
I think that might be one of the most generous descriptions of him that we're going to hear. But we'll go with it. It's fine.
It's a nice one to have. He couldn't really track back. I mean, it's been said that Slot, the manager, would never, ever give a game to Slot, the player. He wasn't kind of fast or muscular. He wasn't a kind of heavy metal footballer at all. What he could do is give the ball at the right moment with the right speed to the right player. And actually, the parallel I draw here is with Louis van Gaal, who was a very similar kind of number 10 who could barely move. It was said of Van Gaal, he ran like he'd swallowed an umbrella. They could see more than they could do, which is similar to Jurgen Klopp as well. He said he was probably more coach than footballer. He played one European match in his career when he was at NAC Breda. It's just very, very undistinguished, but people who kind of love technique had a faint admiration for him. And he says, I don't talk to players about my playing career because it means absolutely nothing to them.
Okay, so how does this guy who spent a lot of time playing lots of football, which nobody notices, is it a natural progression for him into coaching, or is it just a way for him to sort of extend his life in football? Because I imagine like lots of players who've been playing for so long, they don't really know what to do if it's not to do with football.
I think he very much always knew he was going to be a coach. From his parents' school teaching, he was interested in explaining to people. In his last years at Zwolle, he's a kind of coach in training and on the field. He moves on, he becomes a youth coach for Zwolle, which is a nice little town in the east where he has a house still, where even at Feyenoord he was living. He goes up north to Cambuur, becomes assistant and head coach, and then he moves to AZ, which is kind of the closest he's got so far to big football, AZ Alkmaar. First, as a very dominant assistant, so as AZ play a more and more successful pressing game, the papers start to say, well, it's really Slot, the assistant, who's creating all this. And I think what's very important about AZ with hindsight is Billy Beane is involved with AZ. Now, Billy Beane, you'll remember him as the hero of Moneyball, the Michael Lewis book, and then the movie with Brad Pitt. Billy Beane is the guy who brings new stats to baseball and revolutionizes baseball scouting with stats that had been overlooked, like looking at a player's on-base percentage. And with new stats, Billy Beane leads the little Oakland A's to success. And the thing about Billy Beane is he loves soccer. He loves soccer maybe more than he loves baseball. So the last 15 years or so, he's got more and more involved in soccer, and he's always been close to John Henry, who's the owner of Liverpool. John Henry tries to sign Billy Beane for the Boston Red Sox, which Henry also owns. Beane doesn't go, but they always remain close. And so when John Henry buys Liverpool in 2010, he talks to Billy Beane. He says, Billy, you love soccer. Who should I hire to do a Moneyball of soccer at Liverpool? And at the time, Billy names his closest friend in soccer, Damien Comolli, the French technical director who gets the job at Liverpool. It's not terrible. It's not a great success either. But I think that what happened this time, and I was close to the Beane Comolli appointment 15 years ago, but I think what happened this time, I'm speculating, is that Billy Beane is at AZ. He's an advisor to AZ. He bought a share in AZ, and he sees Slot. and is very impressed by Slot. Slot is very much a cerebral coach, very interested in data. And I think that when Liverpool either identified Slot or were looking for a new manager, Billy Beane says, he's a good guy. You should look at him. I will vouch for him. And Billy Beane actually tried to buy into Liverpool 3 years ago. The deal fell through at the last moment. I think that he and John Henry talk a lot, and I would guess that Billy Beane's voice in the appointment of Slot has been very important.
That's really interesting. So in some ways, the appointment of Slot is almost fated given that he is part of the big data models. And as we speak, Michael Edwards, who's also part of that very successful transfer strategy under Liverpool for many years, is returning to the club as chief executive and has also been a big advocate of his signing. So in some senses, Slot was always going to be one of the managers up there in the big data models that Liverpool have been so successful in exploiting. Tell us a little bit more about his time at RZ, because he does very, very well in a season which is hit by COVID. But his departure potentially could be one of the very few stars on his legacy. It was quite an acrimonious departure from RZ to going to Feyenoord.
Yeah, so it's spring 2020 and RZ, with very little money, are keeping pace with the great Ajax. They're equal on points. And then this virus comes in and the Dutch abandon their season. And Ajax and AZ are equal on points, but Ajax have a slightly better goal difference. And then it turns out, I think it was just before that, Slot had been negotiating with Feyenoord. Now, his contract was coming to an end. You're allowed to negotiate. He told AZ he was negotiating with clubs. He didn't tell them he was negotiating with a rival club in Holland. AZ not happy about that at all, and so they sack him. But he then, a year later, 2021, he goes to Feyenoord. So, yeah, as he left AZ in an unhappy way, is kind of the one controversy, I would say, of his career to date. What he's already doing at AZ is he's very much a coach with a vision. Like Pep, like Klopp, he knows exactly how he wants to play, and he wants to play in quite a similar way to them. This very high press slot ball where you press the opponents near their own penalty area, and he steals the Manchester City low pullback cross, which becomes a trademark of AZ. He has this videotech of actions like the low pullback cross, and he can show his players 50 of those and so on. So he's developed very much the style that he wants at AZ, and that's why Feyenoord, who are in a pretty bad place when they hire him, they're fifth in the league, they bring him in. The last 3 days I've been going around listening to Dutch podcasts with Slot talking. So I have his sort of gentle, relaxing voice in my head. And there was a podcast last month called Rondo, where he's on with three legends of Dutch football: Ruud Gullit, Marco van Basten, Rafael van der Vaart, and then Arne Slot. I mean, these guys would never have let him in near them when he was a player. But anyway, there's a question at the end, and Slot is charming and he's very well spoken, explains very well that these stars are in awe of him. And there's a question at the end: who would you like to be? Which footballer would you like to be for a day, if you could? And Van Basten says, well, Johan Cruyff, which is what 99% of people in Dutch football would say.
This is what you're supposed to say. Exactly.
It's what you're supposed to say. It's like when you recite your catechism. And Ruud Gullit says, well, I'd like to be Maradona just so I could feel what it's like to have those kinds of hands on my feet. He's not referring to the hand of God. He's referring to the fact that Maradona touched the ball like he was using his hands. It was so precise. And Slot says, just let me be a player in Jurgen Klopp's or Pep Guardiola's team so that I can hear for a day what special coaches those guys are.
Wow. So he's a true fanboy.
He's a massive fanboy. Yeah. Yeah.
And it does get him into trouble. So I remember, I think when his final team play in the Europa League against Jose Mourinho's Roma, a semi-final which they end up losing, Slot in the press conference beforehand is asked about, you watch a lot of football, and he says, yes, of course, Liverpool under Klopp and Guardiola's Man City, but he also mentions Napoli, who win the league last season in 2023. And after the game, when Mourinho's side have beaten Roma, there is video footage of Mourinho finding Slot in the tunnel and screaming at him, saying, you need to stop watching Napoli. You should have been watching Roma. You should have been watching Roma. So his kind of obsessiveness over videotape has offended the great Jose Mourinho. Having said that, I think Jose Mourinho is pretty easy to offend, and he slaps his chest and says, you need to show us more respect. So yeah, he's clearly got his favourites.
Yeah, Mourinho football is not his thing at all. I think in that video, Slot just ignores him and remains very calm.
Incredibly dignified.
Yes, he has more dignity than Mourinho, but I think most of us do. Yeah.
Actually, after he left AZ Alkmaar, he was ridiculed by some Dutch journalists who said that this guy could never make the jump into a club like Feyenoord because he wasn't up for it. He was just a provincial guy who'd never done anything major and had a COVID hit season where he did pretty well, but he never really won anything. And it's interesting because when Tottenham were interested in Slot in the summer, he compared the parallel of him jumping from AZ to Feyenoord, a leap, as what he thinks it would be like if he went from the Dutch league, the only country he's ever managed in, to actually managing in the Premier League. So he's made the comparison before where he's been doubted and he came up trumps, and he thinks he can do it again, albeit this time it's going to be with Liverpool.
Yes.
So he goes from AZ, from everything I've read, is a very well-run, very structured club, to Feyenoord that are basically a mess. You've spoken about some of the coaching methods, but what are the other influences that he also brings in to create a really structurally stable club that becomes insanely successful and I think overperforms more than any Feyenoord fan in recent decades could have ever imagined?
He's very good at creating a system, at explaining to players, this is the press that I want you to play. Essentially playing very similar football to Liverpool and making players super fit, fitter than they'd ever been before. So they can just do this endless pressing and starting and going again and overlapping fullbacks. They score a lot in the final stages of games, like Liverpool do, because they're fit. Their strikers have not been brilliant, and that's why PSV are even better, playing a very similar kind of football, won the league this year. But really, they're a wonderful team. I can't remember a Feyenoord, this team this good, and a Feyenoord team with such an idea of how to play. I think what he's done very well is all the players understand this is the football we're playing. He's got them to believe that they can play this football. He says he spends much more time talking to players about how we want to play than about how the opponent is going to play. He says that's just much less of an issue. It's how our game that he's managed to get into the heads of his players. And I listened to this very good, I had 3 hours of listening to him on this podcast called Met Open Vizier, where he talks to a fellow coach. And he says, my strength as a coach, his top strength, he says, is passing on information in a way that they start to believe in the team or believe in themselves. And that, I think, is the school teacher in Slot. And it starts very early at Feyenoord. They played his first summer, 2021, they play a friendly against Atlético Madrid. And Atlético, of course, an infinitely bigger club than Feyenoord. And Feyenoord win pre-season. And okay, it's just a friendly, but the players think and the fans think, huh? We were fifth in the Dutch league last year. We're not supposed to beat Atlético. And it shows people, this guy, he has a system. And if we just play the way he wants, it might actually work. And at the end of the game, of course, Diego Simeone, the Atleti manager, is not happy. He comes up and he starts trying to have a fight with Slot. And Slot says, well, what happened is I wanted to shake his hand. He didn't want to shake my hand. And so I laughed. And what Slot does actually is he does this contemptuous laugh in Simeone's face. I myself, in that situation, would have assaulted Slot. And Simeone assaults Slot. Slot talking about it, he says, yeah, I was afraid. I wouldn't like to meet that guy one-on-one. He presents it in a very unmacho-like way. And he's showing the video again. This is on Dutch TV. And he says, yeah, I'm glad one of the players came between us because Simeone essentially would have beaten the crap out of him.
It's true. He looks like the softer, more gentle third Mitchell brother from EastEnders, if there was one. So there's Grant, the really hard one, Phil, the drunk, and then Arne, the sweet one. The slightly chubbier one.
I was going to ask you about one of your specialities is the look of football managers. You always give them a review. What would you make of Slot?
I think he's quite disarming. I think his problem is that people think that he's just a little bit like Erik Ten Hag with a few more kilograms on him. And that is probably going to be a parallel that he wants to shed as quickly as possible. I think given that the main reference point that Premier League fans are going to have for Dutch managers who are insanely successful in the Netherlands is Ten Hag. So he needs to differentiate himself as quickly as possible. You're right, he's not as charismatic as Klopp, but I've seen him. His English is fantastic. I think it's better than Ten Hag's.
He speaks very well. Yeah.
He speaks really well, which is why you've been listening to like ASMR podcasts with him for the last 3 days. He's very easy to do. He's got a slightly dry sense of humour, whereas I think Klopp can be a bit more slapstick. And he kind of reminds me of the first time I ever saw press conferences with Thomas Tuchel as soon as he took over Chelsea. I was very skeptical at the beginning because I didn't know who the guy was. And then I just heard him in a couple of press conferences, and I was immediately sort of sold. And I thought, yeah, this guy is definitely going to be very good at communicating to players. So I imagine Liverpool fans are also going through this process of rapidly searching for content about Slot. And I think they will come away relatively happy with what they find.
About Ten Hag, I'd say they have a lot in common. They don't just look similar, they're very similar as coaches. And I can say that Ten Hag is a wonderful coach of a football team. So why did Ten Hag fail at United, and why am I more optimistic about Slot?
Exactly.
One is that Ten Hag inherited a United team that was a mess, and a team that didn't have the players to play the kind of high-press football he wanted. And the other reason is that United were also organisationally a mess. So they seem to have said to Ten Hag, well, we don't have a transfer system that we trust. So, man, you do all the transfers. Who would you like to buy? And, of course, Ten Hag had mostly been in the Dutch league. So he says, yeah, there's a lot of good players in the Dutch league I'd like to buy, which is how you end up with, a squad of people like Anthony and Malacia and Martinez. And some of them are good players. But, I mean, it's just a very poor way of buying a team for a club as big as United. You should say to the new manager, which is what Liverpool are going to say, Arne, we have this. We've got a map of all the best players in every position in the world. We'll consult you, but you're not making those decisions. We're totally in control of the transfer market. And Slot will say, yeah, fine, you're doing good. You guys know how to do this. I trust you. So poor old Ten Hag had to do the transfer market while knowing only the Mickey Mouse League of the Netherlands. Slot is coming into a much better organisation than Ten Hag did.
And probably one of the best run clubs in the world. So we're pretty bullish about this appointment, and we're giving Liverpool fans lots of reasons to be pretty cheerful about this guy that most of them probably didn't know anything about this time last week.
I caution that what Stefan Szymanski and I show in Soccernomics is managers just don't matter that much. I mean, the quality of the players is more important. So will Liverpool succeed in replacing Virgil van Dijk and Mo Salah, who are coming to the end, who are obviously crucial and almost irreplaceable players? Be reassured also that Liverpool have found Slot through a process. This is not like Chelsea appointing Frank Lampard, with all due respect.
That's because we didn't have a transfer budget that season. Come on, let it go, bruh.
No, but also just saying, oh, well, Lampard was a good player and he's from here, so he'll be a good Chelsea manager, which is
when
ridiculous.
We do the Lampard episode, we will talk about why everything Simon just said is completely wrong, but fine.
Or United appointing Ole Gunnar Solskjaer along the same lines of, he scored the winning goal in a Champions League final 20 years ago and he's a good bloke and everybody likes him and he played here. That's not what Liverpool have done. Liverpool have, I think, led by Will Spearman, who has a PhD in particle physics from Harvard. He's now the director of research at Liverpool. They analyze all these clubs, how much is the manager overperforming relative to the club's budget. You study the coach, you ask people like Billy Beane about him to get a sense of how he works. You do all that research long before you know that Jurgen Klopp is leaving. You already have this mapped out. You're looking at the managers in Europe who are good and who are like Jurgen Klopp. So I think that the due diligence that Liverpool have done is going to be very sophisticated, much more than certain other English clubs, shall we say, have done for their managers.
Okay, you're always throwing shade at Chelsea. There's just no need. Kick a club while it's down, bro.
Yeah, like Chelsea are a brilliantly run club, yeah.
I mean, I kind of agree just looking at what I've seen in Feyenoord playing in some European tournaments and seeing how this Liverpool team play. I think the reliance on wingers, he loves a winger and he loves fullbacks.
Sorry, you watch Conference League football?
Yeah, the Europa, what's it called? The Europa Conference? The one that's not the Europa League, that one.
Yeah, the Conference, I think it's called the Conference League.
Thursdays, there's not that much to do apart from watching Swedish football teams play against Feyenoord.
Feyenoord, they think the Conference League is the Champions League.
They did. They nearly won it. Yeah. Until Mourinho knocked them out. So I think the reliance on wing-backs who can drift into midfield, he has the best wing-back in the world that can do that, Trent Alexander. I also think that Luis Diaz has probably been really underperforming this season, but given that Slot loves a winger, someone that can take a man on, but also is really dynamic, I think he will really thrive. And I also think Diogo Jota, who's sort of one of the forgotten players in this Liverpool squad, who's incredibly prolific but keeps getting injured, I'm going to make a call. I think he's going to score 30 plus goals next season, given what I've seen of Jimenez, this Mexican that they plucked out of nowhere at Feyenoord, and is now going to be the top scorer and is probably going to get a massive transfer fee. We should also probably mention that Slot did everything he did at Feyenoord on a shoestring. I think their record budget for a transfer is something like 9 million euros, and they've never exceeded that. So he's leaving a club that's going to be incredibly financially stable because of the transfer strategy that they've had.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to sell loads of players this summer. The one who I think might come to Liverpool is Luciano Geertruida, who's the right back.
We'll have to do a whole episode just on pronouncing that name.
Yeah, even I stumbled there. Geertruida plays for Holland, plays for Feyenoord, massive power, right back, but can also play central defence. Liverpool have some pretty good players in those positions, but if there's one Feyenoord player who I think Slot is likely to bring, it's him. To do what he's done at Feyenoord, you're right. They have less money than PSV Eindhoven and Ajax. I mean, that's part of the frustration they have with Ajax. Ajax could buy players for, 20 million euros. And at Feyenoord, the whole squad costs 20 million euros. So Liverpool seem to have also gone after Xabi Alonso. Of course, every club in Europe wants him now. The Bayer Leverkusen super winning coach, and Ruben Amorim at Sporting Lisbon. And these are, sort of bigger names than Slot. But to Liverpool's credit, when they couldn't get those guys, they stuck with the profile of the coach they wanted, a kind of Jurgen Klopp style coach, and went for Arne, as the tabloids are going to be calling him.
Or Arne, yeah, sadly.
Yeah, his head stuck onto, photoshopped onto Schwarzenegger's body. Liverpool have been very brave in going with a guy who doesn't immediately command the kind of admiration of the fans as someone like Steven Gerrard or Rooney or Frank Lampard, all coaches who failed, did on their appointments at their clubs. So, good for Liverpool in going for Slot.
Does Slot have any weaknesses as a coach or a character?
I spoke to a friend of mine who knows Slot in Holland, and I said, what problem might he have? And he said, well, he's quite vain. He has a lot of self-esteem. He doesn't like being got at. And of course, the British tabloids are experts at guessing at him. And they're going to do, if Liverpool lose 2 games, they're going to do what my friend calls slot shaming.
That's very good.
It was a pretty good joke, I thought, by a Dutch person about in English.
Can you give him his props, please? Are we not allowed to say that?
Yeah, Hugo Borst, yeah. He's actually...
Give him his... copyright.
He totally deserves it.
IP,
Hugo
intellectual
Borst,
property.
best writer in Holland, yeah. He coined the term slot shaming, and he said when the tabloids do that, Slot has some of Louis van Gaal's self-love. He hides it better than Van Gaal does. Everybody hides it better than Van Gaal does. But, if you have kind of 30 nasty tabloid journalists going after you lose 1-0 at home to Everton, that's not something he's come across before.
And perhaps one word of caution, and in a couple of weeks we'll be releasing our Klopp episode about how difficult it is to replace the legend of Klopp. And that's a problem that Thomas Tuchel has at Borussia Dortmund. Even though statistically he does better than Klopp as his successor, he never actually gets many plaudits for it. So there's a lot of complications replacing a legend like Klopp. And be sure to listen in to that episode in a couple of weeks towards the end of the season.
Yeah, indeed. And I'd say, look, he's not going to become a cult leader like Klopp. And when Bob Paisley replaced Bill Shankly, Paisley didn't try and become Bill Shankly. I mean, Shankly had this magnetic charisma and Paisley didn't. But Paisley was more successful than Shankly, won 3 European Cups in 9 years, not bad. And Slot could be more successful than Klopp, just strictly in trophies. Klopp's last big trophy is the English League of 2020. So that's 4 years ago. It hasn't been a brilliant 4 years for Liverpool. So there's potential for Slot to not become Klopp, but to do a bit better than Klopp has in recent years on the field.
So we usually round off our episodes to ask what would our protagonists be doing if they were not in football. Simon, what do you think?
I'm going to have to apologise and say again, he would have been a school teacher. He would have been your favourite. Right, you always say that. Yeah. We said it about Mbappe. We said it about Wenger, but true in both cases, and it's even more true of Slot. I mean, his whole family are school teachers. And in one of the podcasts, he says, that's really who I am, a school teacher. We're going to try not identify anyone else as a school teacher. And we have identified people with other professions. But yeah, Slot would have been a school teacher.
I'm going to say he could have been Peggy Mitchell's third son that we didn't know about, who could still come back because they always come back somewhere. They're just dredged up from the River Thames. There you go. You heard it here first.
The other question we ask is, would you like to spend an evening with him?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like most people, he's a bit of a black box. I don't know that much about him, and what I've seen, I liked. I can't lie, I'm pretty happy that Klopp is leaving Liverpool because he has made my life as a Chelsea fan pretty miserable. So I'd like Arne, not Arnie, to be successful,
Arne.
but not too successful at Liverpool. Let's put it that way. That's as much as he's getting from me.
I mean, I sort of already have spent an evening with him listening to these podcasts, and I'd say he comes across as a very pleasant, relaxing, and intelligent man. I mean, I think he faces the same problem that Klopp faced, which is that you're living in the same era as Pep Guardiola's Manchester City. And statistically, in terms of points won, but also shots on goal, goals scored, all the metrics you can look at, Manchester City are the best team in England in the 21st century. Klopp's Liverpool are the second best, which means that even if Slot replicates the brilliant work that Klopp has done at Liverpool, you're still in a league with a team that's better than you. Not every day, but most of the time. And so sort of Manchester City is the tragedy of Klopp. But I do think that just coaching against Guardiola will be the biggest thrill of his life, and he will have to restrain himself not to get a selfie with Pep. Or maybe he won't restrain himself.
So he's a human who is going to have to beat his hero.
Thank you for listening to Heroes and Humans of Football. For more information, go to our website at heroesandhumans.com.
And follow us at Heroes and Humans on all social platforms. This show was developed by Immaterial and produced by One Fine Play. Matt Cheney is the series producer. Kazra Firuzia is the editor and producer. We have been your hosts, Mehreen Khan
And Simon Kuper.
and this has been Heroes and Humans of Football.